Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The wind hummed a low, unsteady tune between the buildings, whispering through the narrow alleys. I stopped at the corner of my street, blinking in confusion. Something was wrong. The rows of familiar buildings stood as they always had, brick and concrete, balconies cluttered with forgotten plants and drying laundry. But the street itself seemed to stretch further than it should, twisting in an unnatural way. My apartment should have been just a few steps ahead, but now the path veered sharply, leading into a shadowy alley I had never seen before. I shook my head. Perhaps I was just tired. Work had drained me, and the dull ache in my temples blurred my sense of direction. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. The alley smelled damp, like rain-soaked concrete, but the pavement was dry. A cat darted past me, its shadow stretching unnaturally long under the flickering streetlights. A prickle ran up my spine. I glanced over my shoulder. The street behind me was empty, yet I felt watched. The hum of the city had dimmed. No voices, no distant honking, just the whisper of the wind and my own breathing. I quickened my pace, my shoes tapping against the pavement, the sound echoing in the narrow space. The alley opened into another street. But it wasn't mine. I stopped. This was impossible. The address signs on the buildings were unfamiliar. The neon glow of a convenience store flickered, but I didn't recognize the name. A man exited the store, his footsteps slow and deliberate. His face was obscured by the hood of his jacket, but something about him felt off. Too still. Too aware. I turned back. My street had vanished. A breath hitched to my throat. The city had shifted. I wasn't where I should be. And I wasn't alone. The weight of the silence pressed against my chest, thick and stifling. My breath came in short, measured gulps as I turned, searching for something, anything, that could explain what had just happened. But the city was unfamiliar, twisted into an unrecognizable version of itself. I traced my steps back, past the convenience store with its flickering neon glow, past the buildings whose facades seemed to shift when I looked away. The man in the hood had vanished, but the feeling of being watched had not. Something in my gut twisted. I wasn't just lost. I was trapped. A rustling sound broke the silence. It came from an alleyway to my right, a sliver of darkness between two looming buildings. My pulse quickened. I should keep moving, ignore it, pretend I never heard it. But my feet had other plans. I inched toward the alley, my ears straining to pick up any further movement. The shadows were thick, pulsating as if alive. A faint metallic scent lingered in the air, tinged with something sour. Then, a whisper, soft, almost carried away by the wind. "You shouldn't be here." I froze. My breath hitched to my throat. The alley remained empty, yet the words had been unmistakable. I turned to run, but the street behind me was no longer the one I had come from. The buildings had shifted again, their outlines stretching into unnatural angles, their windows like hollow eyes watching my every move. The city was changing, and it was keeping me inside. The buildings around me loomed higher, their silhouettes stretching into the dark sky like skeletal fingers. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, drowning out the hum of the city that should have been familiar but wasn't. I was surrounded by streets that led nowhere, pathways that turned in on themselves. I needed to move, to find something recognizable, but every step seemed to carry me further from the world I knew. The whisper from the alleyway echoed in my mind, "You shouldn't be here." But where was here? A flickering streetlight cast a sickly glow on the cracked pavement. I followed the light, my footsteps too loud in the unnatural stillness. The air carried a metallic tang, sharp and bitter. I clenched my fists, my fingers cold and numb. Then, another sound. Not a whisper this time, but a scraping, slow, deliberate. It came from behind me. I didn't turn immediately. My instincts screamed at me to move, to run, to not acknowledge whatever it was that had followed me. But something rooted me in place, an icy grip of fear wrapping around my chest. The scraping grew closer. A slow, rhythmic drag, like something being pulled across concrete. Then it stopped. Silence. I turned my head, just a fraction, just enough to glimpse a shadow shifting at the edge of my vision. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs elongated in ways that defied nature. It knew I had seen it. And now, it moved. I ran. The streets twisted and contorted around me, shifting before my eyes. Buildings stretched taller, their windows morphing into hollow, gaping mouths. My breath burned in my throat as I sprinted, my pulse a wild drumbeat against my ribs. The shadow behind me followed. Its footsteps were silent, but I could feel its presence, cold, unnatural. The air around me thickened, slowing my movements as if I were wading through water. The alley I turned into was unfamiliar, the walls too close, pressing in like a tightening grip. Then, a door. Rusty, wooden, slightly ajar. I didn't think. I lunged toward it, shoving it open and stumbling inside. The door slammed shut behind me, the sudden silence almost deafening. My chest heaved as I backed away, pressing myself against the far wall of the dimly lit room. The room was small. Dust floated in the weak glow of a single flickering bulb. Old furniture, draped in white sheets, stood like frozen figures around me. The air smelled of mildew and time long abandoned. I turned, searching for another way out, when I saw it. A mirror, tall and cracked, leaning against the opposite wall. And in its reflection, I wasn't alone. The shadow stood behind me, impossibly close. But as I spun around, nothing. The room was empty. Except for me. And my reflection, which hadn't moved at all. My breath caught in my throat. My reflection watched me, still and unmoving. The air in the room thickened, pressing against my skin like unseen hands. I took a step back. The reflection did not. A chill ran down my spine. I raised a trembling hand, waving it slightly. My reflection remained rigid, its eyes locked onto mine with a hollow, knowing stare. Something was wrong. The silence stretched, oppressive and absolute. The flickering light cast long shadows, distorting the shapes of the covered furniture. My pulse pounded as I dared another step forward. The glass surface of the mirror rippled like water, distorting the frozen image of myself. Then it moved. Not me, my reflection. Its mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. Its head tilted, studying me as though I were the one trapped behind the glass. The cold realization settled in my bones. I was not alone in this place. I turned away, heart hammering. I needed to escape, to find a way out of this impossible nightmare. But the door I had entered through was gone. In its place stood another mirror, identical to the first. More mirrors lined the walls, each reflecting twisted variations of myself, faces stretched, eyes hollow, movements delayed by just a fraction of a second. Panic surged through me. I ran toward the nearest mirror, raising a fist to shatter the glass, but before I could make contact, my reflection's hand shot up, mirroring my movement perfectly this time. It spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was mine, yet it wasn't. It was deeper, layered with something else, something ancient, something wrong. The room trembled. The mirrors cracked, lines splitting across the glass like veins of a living thing. I turned to run, but the floor beneath me gave way. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was my reflection reaching forward, its hands grasping, pulling me in. Then, nothing. Silence. And the feeling that I was no longer in control. Title: The Ghost in the Television. The question haunted me the moment the screen flickered. Did I see that, or was it just my mind playing tricks on me? I sat in my dimly lit living room, the only source of light coming from the television. The house was silent except for the distant hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. The clock on the wall showed well past midnight, yet I wasn't tired. Instead, a vague unease settled over me, like a shadow lurking just outside my field of vision. The news broadcast had ended an hour ago, but I kept the TV on for the comforting background noise. Infomercials and reruns of old sitcoms blurred together. My fingers mindlessly tapped against the remote. Then, the static hit. The abrupt change in sound made my heart skip a beat. A sharp, grating noise replaced the infomercial, the screen flashing with white and black noise. My body stiffened, fingers tightening around the remote as I instinctively pressed buttons, trying to switch channels. Nothing changed. Just static. And then I saw it. A shape within the chaos. A face, barely discernible, peering through the distortion. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a reflection or an artifact of the poor signal. It was something else. The features were vague, blurred by the flickering screen, but the eyes were clear. Wide. Hollow. Watching me. I blinked. The image remained for a heartbeat longer before dissolving into the static once more. My chest tightened as cold fingers of fear crawled up my spine. I leaned forward, my mind racing between explanations. A glitch? A prank broadcast? I swallowed hard, shaking my head as I reached for my phone. The screen glowed, illuminating my trembling fingers. No notifications. No messages. No sign that anything was amiss. I turned back to the television. The static continued, its sound like whispers just beyond comprehension. Then, without warning, the screen shifted again. This time, the image was clearer. A room, familiar yet wrong. It took me a second to realize what I was looking at. It was my living room. My stomach dropped. The angle was slightly distorted, as if viewed through an old camera. But there was no mistaking the details: the worn-out couch, the coffee table, the painting on the wall. And then I saw it. A figure standing near the doorway, half shrouded in shadow. It wasn't me. My breath came in shallow gasps. I twisted my head to look toward the actual doorway. Empty. But on the screen, the figure remained. Still. Waiting. I shot up from the couch, heart hammering against my ribs. The remote slipped from my grasp, clattering to the floor. The static pulsed, the screen flickering as the figure began to move. Slow. Deliberate. Closer. The lights in the room dimmed, as if something was leeching the energy from the air itself. My mind screamed at me to run, to leave the house and never look back. But my body wouldn't move. I was frozen, my eyes locked on the screen as the figure took another step forward. And then the television turned off. The silence was deafening. My own ragged breathing was the only sound in the room. Darkness swallowed the space, pressing in on me from all sides. I reached blindly for the lamp, my fingers fumbling against the switch. Light flooded the room, chasing away the shadows. I was alone. Or so I thought. A sharp, metallic scent filled the air. The smell of something old, something wrong. I turned, my pulse hammering in my ears. The television remained off, but my reflection in the black screen seemed different. My eyes looked hollow, my expression vacant. My hands trembled as I stepped closer. And then, in the screen's reflection, I saw it again. The figure. Standing directly behind me. The silence stretched endlessly. My breathing was shallow, my body locked in place as if bound by invisible chains. The reflection on the dark screen remained unchanged, but I knew what I had seen. The figure. The one that shouldn't be there. I turned sharply, my pulse roaring in my ears. Nothing. The living room was just as it had been, dimly lit, untouched, eerily still. My fingers twitched at my sides, unsure whether to reach for my phone or the remote. Instead, I did neither. The television was off, yet I felt its presence as if it were still running. A weight in the room, a charged anticipation in the air. I stepped closer, hesitantly, my breath catching as I raised a shaking hand toward the screen. My reflection blinked back at me, normal, human. But just as my fingertips grazed the cold surface, the screen flared to life on its own. Static. The shrill crackling sound filled the air, sending a shiver up my spine. White noise swallowed the silence, and amidst the chaotic display of black and white distortion, a whisper. Faint. Unintelligible. I stumbled back, my heartbeat a wild drum against my ribs. The whisper grew louder, words forming but just out of reach. My mind scrambled to make sense of it, to catch a phrase, a meaning. Then the static shifted. Once more, my living room appeared on screen, but this time it wasn't empty. The figure stood in the center of the room, its back facing me. A dark outline against the dim glow of the lamp. My throat went dry. My instinct screamed at me to move, to run, but my legs remained rooted to the floor. Slowly, the figure turned. My breath hitched, the room spinning. The face, or what should have been a face, was distorted, shifting like a smudged painting, never settling. Eyes, hollow and vast, locked onto mine. It tilted its head slightly, as if studying me, its body completely still. A wave of nausea rolled through me, my hands trembling violently. The sound of static grew, morphing into something more, whispers layering upon whispers, building into a crescendo of voices that shouldn't be there. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing myself to breathe. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Then, the voices stopped. Silence. Deafening. Unnatural. I opened my eyes. The screen was black again. My reflection stared back at me. A sharp knock shattered the silence. My body jerked violently at the sound, my head whipping toward the front door, My mind raced. It was past midnight. No one should be at my door. No one should even be outside. Another knock. Louder this time. I forced my feet to move, inching toward the door with slow, measured steps. My breath felt too loud, my own heartbeat reverberating in my skull. I reached out, hesitated, then placed my palm against the wood. Silence again. No sound. No movement. I swallowed hard and pressed my eye against the peephole. Darkness. A void. Blacker than the night itself. A breath, a slow, deliberate exhale echoed from the other side of the door. Then, a voice, low and guttural. Let me in. My blood ran cold. I stumbled backward, my entire body shaking. The television flickered back on, static filling the air once more. On the screen, my living room. And in the doorway of the image, a silhouette. The door handle rattled. I wasn't alone anymore. The door handle rattled again, this time more violently. My breath hitched, my pulse pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, but my body refused to obey. I could only stare as the television flickered, the static pulsating like a living thing. On the screen, the silhouette at the door was no longer a vague shadow. It had taken form, tall, gaunt, with limbs that seemed too long, too sharp. Its head tilted unnaturally, jerking as if struggling to hold itself up. The voice came again, distorted, layered, as if it didn't belong to just one person. Let me in. A wave of nausea gripped my stomach. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with something unnatural. My eyes darted toward my phone on the coffee table, just inches away. If I could reach it. The door shook violently, the hinges groaning under the pressure. My heart jumped to my throat. I took a step back, then another, my legs shaky and weak. The television flickered again. The image on the screen zoomed in on the figure at the door. But then, it turned its head. Not in the real world. On the screen. My stomach lurched. The figure was looking directly at me, as if it could see through the television, as if it knew I was watching. And then it moved. The screen distorted, and in a single glitching flicker, the figure was gone. The door handle stopped rattling. Silence. I swallowed hard, my entire body trembling. My hands clenched into fists, nails digging into my palms. The house felt unnervingly still. No whisper of wind. No hum of the refrigerator. Nothing but the electric buzz of my own panic. I inched toward the door, my bare feet making no sound against the cold floor. I hesitated, my fingers barely brushing the handle. A deep breath. A slow exhale. Then I yanked the door open. The hallway was empty. No footprints. No lingering shadow. Only the dim light from the street lamps outside. The night was quiet, too quiet. The air smelled stale, thick with something metallic. I swallowed the lump in my throat and took a cautious step forward. The moment I did, the door behind me slammed shut. I spun around, my breath catching in my chest. My hands fumbled at the knob, twisting, pulling. It wouldn't budge. It was as if it had locked itself from the inside. Then the television flickered again. I turned my head slowly, dreading what I would see. The screen no longer showed my living room. It showed the hallway I was standing in. But there was something else. A shape standing at the far end, just barely visible in the dim lighting. Unmoving. watching. And then it took a step forward. The static screeched. The static screeched so loud I thought my ears would bleed. I clamped my hands over them, but it did nothing to stop the deafening roar. My body locked in place as my eyes remained fixed on the screen. The figure in the hallway took another step forward. Then another. Slow. Deliberate. The screen flickered, distorting its shape, warping reality. My breath hitched as I realized. It wasn't just on the television anymore. A shadow pooled at the far end of the hall, stretching unnaturally along the floor, creeping closer. My pulse pounded in my throat as I backed away, my heels striking the wall behind me. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers shaking as I tapped the screen. Dead. No battery. The television screen flickered again, and the image changed. It showed my living room empty now, except for one thing. My reflection. Staring back at me. I swallowed hard, the taste of copper on my tongue. My reflection did not move when I did. It stood motionless, watching. Then, slowly, ever so slowly, it tilted its head. A whisper, no, a chorus of whispers, filled the room. Layers of voices, overlapping, growing, filling every crevice of my mind. I pressed my hands against my temples, trying to silence them, but they burrowed deeper, gnawing at my sanity. The lights flickered. A guttural sound rumbled from the television, something between a growl and a sigh. The shadow in the hallway took another step, and I could finally see it. A gaunt figure, its limbs stretched too long, its head lolling at an unnatural angle. Its skin, or what remained of it, clung tightly to its bones, as if stretched over a frame that wasn't meant to be human. Its eyes, hollow voids, locked onto mine. It grinned. A choked gasp escaped my lips. My body screamed to move, to run, but fear had its claws deep in me. I could only watch as it raised one skeletal hand and pointed directly at me. The television screen went black. The whispers stopped. Silence. Then a voice, deep and familiar. It's your turn. The lights died, plunging the room into darkness. Darkness swallowed the room. My breath came in ragged gasps, my pulse hammering in my ears. I reached out blindly, my fingers fumbling against empty air. The silence was thick, suffocating, pressing against me like an unseen force. Then, a sound. A whisper. Soft at first, a barely audible murmur. But it grew. A chorus of voices, overlapping, filling every corner of my mind. My head ached with their weight, an unbearable pressure building behind my eyes. Then, the television flickered back to life. Static, pulsing and alive. The image distorted, shifting erratically before settling on a single frame. Me. Not my reflection. Not a recording. It was me, standing in the same dark room, staring at the screen. But there was something off. My movements were delayed, just a fraction of a second behind. My expression was blank, my eyes hollow. Then, my mouth moved. But I didn't speak. The voice came from behind me. A guttural rasp. Turn around. Cold washed over me. Every muscle in my body locked in place. I couldn't. I wouldn't. But the voices swelled, their insistence burrowing into my thoughts, tearing at my resolve. The screen flickered again. The version of me on the television turned its head. And something was standing behind it. A figure. A towering shadow, its limbs contorted, its face a twisted approximation of something human. My stomach clenched. I felt it. The weight of something behind me. Watching. Waiting. Turn around. The lights in the room burst to life, flooding everything in an unnatural, blinding glow. My vision blurred, my knees buckled. The static roared in my ears, the sound vibrating through my bones. And then, silence. The room was empty. The television was off. The air was still. I staggered back, my pulse still erratic. Had it been real? I turned to the door, my hand reaching for the handle. But something was there. A small object, resting just outside the threshold. A broken ring. Old, rusted. Familiar. My breath caught in my throat. My mind raced, trying to piece together a memory that hovered just out of reach. Then, the television clicked back on. Static filled the room once more. And on the screen, the door behind me creaked open. The darkness of the tunnels was all-consuming, swallowing every trace of light and sound. My flashlight flickered, its weak glow barely illuminating the damp brick walls. The air was thick, stagnant, carrying the scent of decay and something else, something metallic, like old blood. I had been down here for too long, but turning back was not an option. Not after what I had found. The investigation started like any other. A series of missing persons cases, all connected by a single clue. Each individual had last been seen near an entrance to the forgotten underground tunnels beneath the city. It was an old, crumbling network of passageways, abandoned decades ago and left to rot beneath our feet. No one paid much attention to them anymore, except for me. I had spent weeks researching, tracking leads, and gathering any information I could find. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that the disappearances were no coincidence. Someone, or something, was using the tunnels. I took a cautious step forward, my boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The sound of my breathing was too loud, echoing back at me from the narrow passage. The further I walked, the more unnatural the silence became. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the feeling that something was listening, waiting. A sudden gust of air brushed against my neck, cold and damp, carrying a faint whisper. I froze, tightening my grip on the flashlight. The beam trembled as I scanned the tunnel ahead. My pulse hammered in my ears. Had I imagined it? No, I was sure I heard something, a hushed voice, barely audible, yet unmistakably real. I moved forward, forcing myself to ignore the growing unease creeping up my spine. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing, pressing against me. My breathing quickened. The tunnel stretched on endlessly, curving out of sight, its walls lined with old rusted pipes that dripped with moisture. Shadows flickered as I passed, twisting and shifting in unnatural ways. And then, I saw it. A figure, just a glimpse, at the very edge of my light. It was gone in an instant, vanishing into the darkness. My chest tightened. I wasn't alone. A shuffling sound echoed from deeper within the tunnel. My heart pounded as I took a slow, measured step forward. The flashlight flickered again, struggling against the oppressive dark. I swallowed hard. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it another investigator? A lost wanderer? Or was it something else entirely? The silence returned, heavier than before. I exhaled sharply, forcing my nerves to settle. I had to keep going. The truth was down here, buried beneath the city, waiting to be uncovered. But as I moved forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That whatever had been standing there a moment ago had not left. It was still here, hidden in the shadows, watching. I took another step. Then another. The tunnel opened into a wider chamber, its ceiling high and arched like an underground cathedral. The air was thick with dampness, and something else, a strange, cloying scent that made my stomach twist. My flashlight swept across the room, revealing old wooden crates, scattered debris, and then something far worse. A row of objects lined the far wall. At first, they looked like mannequins, standing eerily still in the dim light. But as I stepped closer, the truth became sickeningly clear. They weren't mannequins. They were bodies. Each one arranged carefully, propped against the wall, their faces frozen in expressions of horror. Their eyes were open, staring, their mouths twisted as if caught mid-scream. A wave of nausea rose in my throat. A noise, a soft, rasping breath. My head snapped toward the sound. One of the figures twitched. My breath caught. It wasn't dead. Before I could react, the flashlight flickered once more, then died. The tunnel plunged into darkness. And in that moment, I heard it again. The whisper. Closer this time. Right behind me. The darkness was absolute. My breath came in shallow gasps, each one sounding too loud in the suffocating silence. My fingers fumbled over the flashlight, pressing the switch again and again, but the beam refused to return. The whispering voice had been close, too close. I wasn't alone in the tunnels. I turned slowly, my muscles tense, listening for any sign of movement. The air was thick with an oppressive stillness, yet I could feel it, that presence lingering in the shadows, watching. My pulse pounded in my ears as I reached for my phone, desperate for any source of light. As the screen lit up, the weak glow barely cut through the blackness, but it was enough to catch a glimpse of something shifting at the edge of my vision. A shape. A figure, just beyond the reach of my light. I staggered backward, my heels scraping against the damp stone floor. The sound echoed through the tunnel like a gunshot, breaking the silence. And then, the whispering resumed. Low. Insidious. It seeped into my bones, an eerie murmur that didn't belong to this world. The words were indistinct, hushed, but they held a cadence, a message just beyond comprehension. I forced myself to move. Slowly at first, then faster, my steps quickening as panic gripped my chest. I needed to get out. Needed to find an exit, a way back to the surface. The tunnels twisted around me, disorienting, each corridor identical to the last. My mind reeled, struggling to recall the path I had taken. I had mapped this place out before descending, yet now every passage seemed foreign, unfamiliar. Something brushed against my shoulder. I spun around, my phone's lights swinging wildly, illuminating nothing but empty air. My breath hitched. I knew I hadn't imagined it. The whispering grew louder, wrapping around me like a suffocating fog. My legs moved before I could think, sprinting blindly into the darkness. My foot struck something solid, sending me tumbling forward. The impact knocked the breath from my lungs, pain jolting through my hands as I caught myself against the ground. The whispering stopped. Silence stretched around me, thick and unnatural. I pushed myself up, heart hammering. My phone had slipped from my grasp, its dim glow illuminating something ahead. A doorway. The frame was old, metal rusted and corroded with age. It stood slightly ajar, a sliver of deeper darkness lurking beyond. I had no choice. I moved forward, pushing the heavy door open with trembling hands. A rush of cold air spilled out, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of rot and something else, something old, ancient. The air shifted as if disturbed by unseen movement. I hesitated for only a second before stepping through. The room was vast, far larger than I expected. My phone's weak light barely reached the edges, but I could make out shapes, shelves stacked high with boxes, old machinery covered in dust and grime. A storage chamber, perhaps, long forgotten beneath the city. Then, something scraped against the floor behind me. I whirled around. The doorway was still open, the tunnel beyond empty. But I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't alone. A shadow detached itself from the darkness. And then it moved toward me. I took a step back, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it would burst from my chest. The shadow advanced, slow but deliberate, as if savoring the moment. My breath hitched as the air around me grew colder. My phone's screen flickered, the weak glow dimming as if the very presence of this thing was draining the light from the world. I forced myself to move, stepping backward, my fingers searching blindly for anything I could use as a weapon. My back pressed against something solid, one of the rusted metal shelves that lined the room. The shadow stopped just outside the reach of my phone's dying light. It stood there, watching, waiting. Then, a voice. Low, rasping, filled with something unnatural. You shouldn't have come here. A chill ran through me, and I shuddered. The words were barely a whisper, but they carried a weight, a warning laced with something far worse than menace. It wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. My fingers closed around something cold and metallic. A rusted pipe, its surface rough with age. My grip tightened. I didn't know if I could fight whatever this thing was, but I wouldn't go down without trying. I raised the pipe, my breath shallow, the sound of my own pulse loud in my ears. The shadow moved. It came fast, a sudden rush of darkness that swallowed the space between us. I swung wildly, the pipe cutting through empty air. The force of my own swing nearly sent me off balance. A whisper curled around me, an unseen presence brushing my skin like ice. Then something grabbed my wrist. I gasped, twisting, but there was nothing there. Just the sensation of fingers, cold, too long, impossibly strong, clutching me, dragging me forward. I fought, yanking my arm back, but the grip tightened. My phone clattered to the ground, its light sputtering and dying. Darkness swallowed me whole. I thrashed, panic taking over, every instinct screaming at me to escape. My breath came in ragged gasps as the whispering filled my head, overlapping voices, each one speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I was losing myself, sinking into the black. Then, a sound, a distant echo. Faint, but familiar. Footsteps. Hope flared through my panic. Someone else was down here. I forced myself to focus, to push through the terror gripping my chest. If I could just move, if I could reach whoever was out there. The grip on my wrist vanished. I stumbled forward, falling hard onto the damp concrete. My vision swam, the cold of the tunnel pressing in around me. The whispers faded, receding into the dark corners of the chamber. I sucked in a shaky breath, forcing myself to move. I had to find the source of those footsteps. I had to get out of here. Pushing myself up, I grabbed my fallen phone, the screen cracked but still flickering dimly. The footsteps were closer now. Slow, measured. Someone, or something, was approaching. I wasn't sure which possibility scared me more. The footsteps echoed through the tunnel, each step measured, deliberate. My breath hitched as I pressed myself against the cold stone wall, gripping the cracked phone tightly. The faint glow of the screen barely illuminated the space around me, but it was enough to catch glimpses of shifting shadows in the periphery of my vision. I wasn't alone. The air had changed, thicker, heavier, suffused with something unseen yet suffocating. My fingers trembled as I tapped at my phone, hoping to summon more light. The screen flickered but held, its glow reflecting off the damp tunnel walls. The footsteps had stopped. Silence stretched, thick and expectant. Then, a whisper, so close it felt like icy breath against my ear. "You're not supposed to be here." I spun, swinging the rusted pipe I had gripped so tightly in my other hand. The metal whistled through empty space, meaning nothing but air. My pulse pounded as I staggered forward, searching the darkness for any sign of movement. The silence broke. A scraping sound, something sharp dragging against stone. It came from ahead, deeper into the tunnel. The logical part of my mind screamed at me to turn back, to run, but I knew I couldn't. Whatever was down here, it wasn't just watching. It was waiting. I forced myself forward, each step slow and cautious. The tunnel walls seemed to tighten, pressing in as if guiding me towards some unseen fate. My breaths were shallow, my grip tightening around the pipe. The scent of damp earth and decay grew stronger with each passing second. Then, ahead, my phone's feeble light revealed something, an opening in the tunnel, a doorway leading into a wider chamber. The walls here were different. Not brick or stone, but metal. Rusted, corroded, as if time itself had forgotten this place. I hesitated at the threshold. Beyond the doorway, the chamber was vast, filled with old machinery and rows of shelves stacked with things long abandoned. My light skimmed over them, catching glimpses of crumbling paper, rusted tools, and something else, something glinting in the darkness. I stepped inside. A mistake. The door behind me slammed shut. Darkness swallowed me whole, my phone's light flickering violently before dying completely. My breath came in quick gasps as I reached for the door, pushing, pulling, nothing. It wouldn't budge. My heart pounded, the silence thick and oppressive. Then, a sound. Not footsteps this time. A breath. Slow, measured, coming from the far end of the chamber. And then, a whisper, curling through the dark like smoke. "You found us. Now you stay." The whisper lingered in the air, curling around me like unseen tendrils. My fingers fumbled against the door, pressing and pulling with increasing desperation. The silence after the words was worse than the whisper itself. It was waiting, watching. My breath hitched. I turned slowly, the darkness stretching endlessly before me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, something, someone, standing in the vast chamber, just beyond the reach of my senses. My fingers curled around the rusted pipe I still clutched, the cold metal grounding me in the present. A scrape. A slow drag of something sharp against metal. My heart pounded, the sound reverberating in my ears. It wasn't coming from one direction. It was everywhere. Then, movement. A shadow flickered. My body tensed. My phone was useless, its screen cracked and dark, the last of its battery drained. I had nothing but the pipe and whatever courage I could muster. I forced my breath to steady, listening intently. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, circling me. My skin prickled as if unseen eyes traced my every movement. I swallowed hard, gripping the pipe tighter. I had to move. Staying still would only make me an easier target. I took a slow step forward, the ground damp beneath my boot. Another step. Then another. The whispers returned, layered and overlapping, growing louder with each breath I took. Words I couldn't understand, voices that didn't belong to the living. Then, just ahead, something shifted. A faint outline in the dark. My muscles locked as a shape emerged, a figure, impossibly thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It stood motionless, yet every instinct screamed that it was aware of me. I exhaled shakily and took a step back. It moved. Now walking, gliding, swift and soundless. My pulse surged. I turned sharply, lunging for the nearest shelf, knocking over a stack of rusted cans as I stumbled back. The sound crashed through the silence, deafening. And then, the lights flickered. A single, dim fluorescent bulb buzzed weakly to life, casting long, jagged shadows across the chamber. My chest heaved as I glanced around, searching. But the figure, it was gone. Had it ever been there? The whispers had stopped. The suffocating pressure in the air had lifted, just slightly. My hands trembled as I steadied myself. I needed to get out. Now. I turned back to the door, forcing my breath to slow. My fingers brushed over the rusted handle, and it moved. Not by my touch. The door creaked, opening just an inch, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. A way out? I hesitated. Then, bracing myself, I pulled the door open wider and stepped through. The tunnel stretched ahead, familiar yet different. My heart pounded in my chest as I walked forward, my steps unsteady. The air was colder, heavier. My mind raced. Had I escaped? Then, just as I reached the bend in the tunnel, a faint sound drifted through the darkness. A whisper. Soft. Amused. See you soon. Do you ever get the feeling that someone is watching you? It started with a simple assignment. A cold case that had gone unsolved for over 2 decades. I had covered crime stories before, but this one was different. There was something about it that made the hairs on my neck stand up. I was sitting in my cramped apartment, the glow of my laptop screen flickering against the darkness. The case file was spread out before me, photographs, reports, notes scribbled in the margins. A woman named Lillian Carter had vanished in 1998, leaving behind a grainy VHS tape as her only clue. The tape had never been released to the public, locked away in the evidence room of a police station that barely had the funds to keep its lights on. That was until someone had sent me a copy. The package arrived at my door a week ago. No return address, no note. Just an old VHS tape in a battered cardboard box. I should have ignored it. Should have left it alone. But curiosity is a disease, and I was already infected. I dug my fingers into my temples, pushing away the headache that had been lingering all day. The television sat in the corner of my apartment, an old CRT model I had picked up from a thrift store years ago. I still remembered the way the cashier had hesitated before selling it to me, like she knew something I didn't. I took the tape, slid it into the player, and pressed play. Static. The familiar white noise hissed through the speakers, the screen flickering with black and white distortions. Then, a frame. A hallway, dimly lit, stretching into the distance. The camera was handheld, shaking slightly as it moved forward. A single bulb flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the peeling wallpaper. My stomach tightened. I had seen hundreds of crime scene tapes before, but this one felt different. It felt wrong. A woman's voice, barely a whisper. "He sees me." The camera turned sharply. A door at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar. The voice came again, urgent now. "He's coming." Then, the static returned. I sat frozen, my fingers tightening around the remote. The footage had lasted less than 30 seconds, but it was enough to send a cold shiver down my spine. Something about the voice, the way it trembled, the desperation behind it, felt too real. I rewound the tape, played it again. The same hallway, the same flickering bulb. But something was different this time. The shadows had moved. I stared at the screen, my breath hitching. There, just at the edge of the frame, something had shifted. A dark shape, barely visible, lurking in the corner of the hallway. I hadn't noticed it before. I paused the video, leaned closer. Two eyes, glinting in the darkness. My phone buzzed, the sudden vibration making me jolt. I grabbed it, my fingers fumbling to unlock the screen. A message. Unknown number. Stop watching. My blood ran cold. I looked back at the television, the frozen frame staring back at me. The dark shape was still there. Still watching. The VHS tape whirred inside the player, the screen flickering. And then, the whisper. Right behind me. The room was dead silent except for the faint hum of my TV. My breath hitched as I turned my head, heart hammering against my ribs. There was nothing behind me. No whisper. No shadow shifting in the dim glow of the screen. But the feeling lingered, that cold, suffocating presence pressing against my skin. I grabbed my phone, fingers trembling, and reread the message, "Stop watching." My mind raced. Who had sent it? How did they know what I was doing? I stood up abruptly, pushing away from my desk, my chair scraping against the floor. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to run, but I was too deep now. Too tangled in whatever this was. I turned back to the TV. The VHS player whirred, the tape still running. The screen was frozen on that final frame, those two pinprick eyes glinting from the shadows. I swallowed hard, then pressed play. Static. Then, the hallway again, but something had changed. The camera was no longer shaking. It moved smoother, more deliberate. The dim light flickered just as before, but the walls looked different. Darker. Wetter. As if the rot had spread deeper into the wallpaper. My stomach clenched. The voice came again. "He's here." A loud crack split through the recording. The camera tilted, and for a split second, I saw a foot, a pale, bare foot stepping into the frame from the right. My chest tightened as a low creak echoed from my own apartment. Not from the TV. From my hallway. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The door to my bedroom stood slightly open, a sliver of darkness stretching beyond it. I could have sworn it had been shut moments ago. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, drying out all rational thought. I reached for the nearest object, a half-empty coffee mug, and stepped cautiously toward the doorway. My fingers hovered over the light switch. Just turn it on, I told myself. Just prove to yourself there's nothing there. I flipped the switch. The bulb flickered once. Then, darkness. A sharp inhale. Not mine. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the mug. My phone buzzed again. Another message. I fumbled to unlock the screen. You let him in. A cold sweat broke out across my skin. My mind screamed for me to leave, but my body refused to move. My eyes darted back to the television. The VHS was still rolling. The hallway was empty now, but the door at the end was open. Something moved inside. My breathing was uneven, each inhale sharp, each exhale trembling. The words on my phone screen burned into my mind, you let him in. My fingers tightened around the device as my eyes flicked between the dark hallway and the television screen. The VHS kept playing. The door at the end of the hallway on the tape stood open, the darkness inside it impenetrable. My gut twisted as the camera began to move forward, creeping closer. I wanted to turn it off. Wanted to run. But I couldn't. The camera reached the threshold, and the audio crackled with distortion. The frame stuttered. A figure emerged, tall, thin, unnaturally still. Its head tilted, as though it knew I was watching. Then, the screen went black. Silence. A sharp knock shattered the quiet. I jumped, heart slamming against my ribs. The knock had come from my front door. 3 slow, deliberate raps. My mind screamed at me not to answer. Another buzzed from my phone. Don't open it. My breath hitched. I swallowed hard, trying to think. Whoever was outside already knew I was here. Knew I was watching. My gaze darted back to the screen. The VHS had resumed. The camera was now inside the darkened room. A figure stood in the center, its face obscured by static interference. The room was identical to mine, same furniture, same layout. My stomach churned as the camera panned, revealing something even worse. My apartment door. The one behind me. A distorted voice rasped through the speakers. He's here. The knocking stopped. A click. My doorknob turned ever so slightly. I bolted forward, pressing my weight against the door, locking it, deadbolting it. My pulse pounded so loud it drowned out all else. My phone buzzed again. Too late. Cold air brushed the back of my neck. Behind me, the television flickered. The figure on the screen had turned to face me. And then, the whisper. Closer than ever. The whisper sent ice through my veins. It was right behind me. I could feel the weight of something unseen pressing against my back. The television flickered violently, the static warping and twisting the figure on the screen. It was watching me. No, it knew me. I didn't dare turn around. My muscles locked, my breath shallow. The deadbolt on my door was secure, but that meant nothing anymore. Not when reality itself had begun to fray at the edges. My phone buzzed in my trembling hand. Look. I shook my head. I wouldn't. I couldn't. Every instinct in me screamed that if I turned around, if I laid eyes on whatever stood there, I wouldn't survive it. The air behind me grew colder, the lights dimmed. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. The television screen glitched again. The static faded, and a new image took its place. My apartment. From behind me, a sickening wave of dread rolled through me. The screen showed my own back, my own frozen posture. and just over my shoulder, a shadow. It stood tall, its head tilting in a grotesque mockery of curiosity. Its fingers twitched, reaching. I squeezed my eyes shut. I wouldn't look. I wouldn't give it that power. The screen flickered. The voice returned, low and distorted, layered with something deeper, something not human. I see you. A rush of air against my neck. A touch, cold, delicate, brushing against my skin. I snapped. With a ragged gasp, I spun, swinging my phone like a weapon. The room was empty. No figure. No shadow. Just my own ragged reflection in the darkened window. My knees nearly buckled, my body screaming for escape. I turned back to the TV. The screen was black. The VHS had stopped. The tape had ejected itself. My phone buzzed one last time. Almost time. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of the room, watching the door, watching the screen, waiting for the whisper to return. Waiting for whatever had come through to finish what had started. The night stretched on in suffocating silence. Every shadow in my apartment felt deeper, every flicker of light seemed unnatural. I hadn't moved from my corner, hadn't dared to close my eyes. My phone was still in my hand, the last message burned into my mind, almost time. Time for what? I flinched at every creak in the floorboards, every groan of the pipes. I tried to rationalize it, old building, shifting structure, but my mind wouldn't accept the excuse. Not after what I had seen. The VHS still sat in the player, untouched. I didn't dare eject it, didn't dare look at it. Something told me that as long as it stayed inside, whatever was on it remained trapped. But then my television turned on by itself. Static filled the screen. A soft hiss, low and droning, like a breath drawn through clenched teeth. My pulse hammered in my ears as the image flickered. The screen showed my apartment again, but this time it was live. I saw myself in the corner, hunched, wide-eyed, staring at the screen. The camera angle was impossible, hovering, shifting, circling me as if something unseen was watching from just outside my vision. Then, the camera began to move. It panned across the room, slow and deliberate. My blood turned to ice as it reached the hallway. The door to my bedroom was open. I knew for a fact I had locked it. A shadow drifted across the threshold. Something stepped inside. My breath caught in my throat. The figure on the screen was impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and unnatural. Its head tilted, the same grotesque curiosity as before. But this time, it stepped forward. The static deepened, the screen distorting as the figure moved closer to me. I turned my head toward the hallway, stomach twisting into knots. The bedroom door was still open, but it was empty. I snapped my gaze back to the TV. The figure was gone. I bolted upright. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I scanned the room, my own reflection trembling in the black screen of the television. The air was thick, pressing against me like invisible hands. Then, a whisper, soft, almost affectionate, directly against my ear. Time's up. The lights shut off. The screen filled with static. The door behind me creaked open. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.